But the thing that was most intriguing to me is that I was recruited by the Justice Department, the United States Department of Justice, most of which involved pushing papers in Washington, D.C., and I didn't have any interest in that. And I said, they said, what would you like to do? And I said, I would like to stay in New York, and I would like to try cases. And he said, well, we have a spot in the customs section of the civil division, and that's all they do.
Welcome, everyone, to the Simply Trade podcast. I'm your host, Anik, and I am here at the GTE conference, and I'm not alone, as you can see. This is a little bit of a different setup. I'm with Frank Desiderio from GDLSK, a founding partner, GDLSK, which is just incredible to have you here. I've been trying to get him to do an interview with me for quite some time. And we finally got to it. We've been kind of in contact for a while now. And I want to thank you so much for doing this with me.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so we're going to do a little bit of a different segment today. So usually we talk trade, we talk politics. Well, not so much politics, but kind of getting into the compliance segment of things. And today we're going to have a little bit of a different approach because we are going to talk to, well, I am going to talk to Frank more about how he became a trade attorney and what the journey was like. So let's take you all the way back when you were a little kid. Did you have hobbies? What was young little Frank like?
Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I always wanted to be a cowboy. And there was no future for cowboys in Brooklyn, so I had to think of something else. Just going to school and proceeding and trying to discover what might be of interest to me. That was it. No plans, nothing, no particular passions at that point in time.
No horses?
No, we couldn't afford horseback riding, even though the rides were about 50 cents a ride, but it was, that was an expensive item for us.
Yeah. And so as a little kid, no specific, routes to go be a trade attorney, nothing. Okay. So then you went on to high school, I assume. And what was that? Did you discover yourself a little bit more?
A little bit more. I went to a boys' Catholic high school in Brooklyn. It was pretty rigorous. We had very intense training and whatnot. And near the end of my studies there, I took a proficiency test, and they said that really a good spot for me would be in architecture or design. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I was pretty good in mechanical drawing, and it sounded quite interesting. So I was able to get a summer position with a very prestigious civil engineering firm. They designed and built Shea Stadium, Chavez Ravine, and whatnot. And I was just an office boy. I delivered the mail, I ran errands, I chauffeured for the president and so on. And these are really top-notch engineers and architects, and they all went to Harvard and MIT and Rensselaer Polytech. And I gave, aside from distributing the mail, I gave out the paychecks. And I found out that these fellows from Yale and Harvard and Princeton and so on weren't making very much money. They were working for a very prestigious firm. But the guy who was making the most money was the office manager, the business manager, who was a lawyer who went to Brooklyn Law School. So I said, Rensselaer, I don't know. Harvard, Brooklyn I could do. And that's how I wound up going forward with law.
But when you were in college, did you still have that architectural
No, it wasn't something that was driving. It was an exam that identified an aptitude that I had, and I decided for financial reasons not to pursue it. But I was always very interested in history. I was interested in big cities and the architecture and the history of those buildings and things like railroads, airplanes, things of that nature. I was always fascinated by the evolution of those particular items.
Yeah, so would you say, this is a fun question, would you say you followed your dream or the money? Or now that you look back at it, what do you think?
Well, I was looking for the money. I didn't have a trust fund, and I knew I wanted to live a certain life. I grew up in a nice neighborhood in Brooklyn, surrounded by people who had, means, and I really wanted to enjoy that lifestyle. So I really had to make an intelligent decision as to how I would support that lifestyle.
Because I know a lot of people question themselves specifically at my age or just like starting up. What do? Do you, if you're passionate to to be a hairdresser or, whatever it is. You can make great money, but how do you do it? Or how do you pursue that? Or do you go for something else? It's just a wide range of questions, I think, in life that you go through to get where you want to be. Okay, so we're going to jump back to college. Did you have any side jobs in college? What was life like in college? Did you party?
I certainly partied, but I had every kind of side job you could think of. I drove taxis. I loaded trucks for UPS. I worked for caterers as a waiter and so on. And, just to get through school and to be able to do the things I wanted to do, to take a lady on a date or take her to a play. I wanted to have some money in my pocket. My parents said, your tuition, your support is on us. But if you want to take a girl to a movie or buy a car, it's on you. And so I always had money in my pocket, and I was always able to do something that I liked.
I think a taxi driver in New York is interesting.
Very interesting. Not the safest profession, but it was very interesting.
So did you tell your taxi guests when you had conversations that you're in school for trade law?
Well, I wasn't talking about trade law at the time. I wasn't, I really wasn't. I was just maybe starting law school. I did some at the end of college and early law school. Not really. New York cab drivers, most passengers don't speak to them. You just come with the furniture. You're attached to the wheel. But I had some interesting stories and events, but we don't want to go into those here.
But did you meet some people that you might still know or still remember that, inspired you or...
Well, there was actually a lawyer got in my taxi cab and he wanted me to take him to Bay Ridge. That's where I grew up. And he said, I'll tell you how to get there. And I say, I know how to get there because that's where I live. And we chatted and we knew a lot of, we had a lot of common acquaintances. And, I was still in law school and he said, keep up the good work and so on. And then 3 years later, I met him at a bar association meeting and he said, I told you were going to do
Wow. See, that's amazing. That's so inspiring
And he was a very prominent New York City lawyer, so it really kind of impressed me that he was in my corner, I guess, from the beginning.
Yeah, that's awesome. And getting through law school, was that tough, or was it challenging for you? Or
it was challenging. I really worked hard. I always did well in school, but I didn't work very hard. But working in law school was really important. I started. And some of the members of my class, I went to St. John's University Law School. Some of the members of my class had gone to the University of Pennsylvania, the Military Academy, Harvard, Air Force Academy, Naval Academy, really top-notch schools. And St. John's had a reputation for kind of filtering out the bottom of the class at the end of the first semester. So I said, I'm cooked. I'm never going to be able to compete with these people. Yeah. And it turns out that I pretty much wound up on the top of the class above those people. So it was kind of a mission that I had. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to accomplish it, but I did. Check
made. And moving after law school, what happened? Did you get offers? Did you look for a job? Were you already in talks before?
I looked for jobs. The recruiters, the big firms came to the school and invited me back for interviews and whatnot. But the thing that was most intriguing to me is that I was recruited by the Justice Department, the United States Department of Justice, that had an honors program. So they were only interviewing people, I think, in the top 5 or 10% of the class. So I was one that was invited to an interview. And I got the job. And one other good friend of mine from law school got the job as well. And we didn't really talk very much about that. There are lots of different options, most of which involved pushing papers in Washington, D.C., and I didn't have any interest in that. And I said, they said, what would you like to do? And I said, I would like to stay in New York, and I would like to try cases. And they said, well, we have a spot in the customs section of the Civil Division, and that's all they do. It's the only section of the United States Department of Justice that's headquartered outside of Washington, D.C., and that's all they do is try cases.
And is that the first time you said customs? Is that the first time you got into the trade sector?
Absolutely. I had no knowledge of it. All I knew that I would be trying cases, and I'd be based in New York. I also knew that in those days we traveled around the country. Trying cases in L.A. and Boston and Seattle and New Orleans and whatnot. So that was kind of intriguing to me as well, aside from the subject matter.
So you got to travel, practice some good law, and you're probably learning from even better lawyers at that point, right?
We had 28 lawyers in the section, some of them, and we had a 4-year commitment. So most of the lawyers had 4 years or more in the practice, and they were great mentors. And some of them became my competitors in later life and founded other firms and so on. But we've always remained friends. But it was an interesting time because we had 28 attorneys and 1 computer.
Oh,
can you imagine that?
No.
We had 1 computer. So if you decided to reorganize your arguments in a brief and you wanted to put point 3 where point 1 was, that meant retyping everything.
Yeah.
And we had to do it in 5 copies. So you had carbon paper. Do you even know what carbon paper is?
No.
Okay. Well, that's okay. You didn't miss anything. But so that was quite a different way to start out a profession without the kind of tools that exist today.
You're talking about mentors. How important was mentorship throughout this time? I mean, law school and then getting into your first position.
My first position is where I really saw my most important mentor. He was the chief of the section. He was a Harvard law graduate, Harvard undergraduate, and he was the nicest guy in the world, but he was very unforgiving. We would prepare our correspondence, our briefs, communications to the court, our adversaries, and he read everything every day that every lawyer in the section drafted before it was sent out. So our presentations would go to a reviewer who would make some comments, and then finally, if you passed that stage, you'd go to see the chief of the section, and he would sit down in his office at 6 o'clock at night and go over, his suggestions, his recommendations, and he was very unforgiving. But it was he was a brilliant man and a brilliant mentor.
And did he stay in your life throughout, like even after? Because I know you didn't stay at your first job forever, obviously.
That's correct. Actually, I wound up buying a house around the corner from him in Scarsdale. So we did see each other frequently thereafter. He was a big theater buff. I'm a big theater buff. So sometimes he would have tickets and he couldn't use them and he'd give them to me and so on. But he was a great man, brilliant lawyer, and very generous, kind, but hard.
Well, it seemed like you took some of that over, right?
I mean, my view was, I'm just a poor kid from Brooklyn, and I have this opportunity, and I just wanted to maximize that opportunity.
Yeah. So once you had that job, I know, did you move to, because obviously you founded GDLSK with a few other partners. How did that come about?
Well, that's an interesting story. So I won't go into some of the detail, but I had an opportunity to start my own general practice.
Yeah, and this came after?
Justice.
Okay.
So I left Justice, and the normal track would be to go to work for a customs law firm. There weren't very many of them around at the time. And so...
And why do you think that was?
Some of I don't know, some of those firms had been around for 3 generations. And for whatever reason, they weren't really growing. There was really one big firm. The other ones were rather small, but successful. So I opened an office in Brooklyn, and I was starting to do general practice work, criminal defense work, real estate closings. Every once in a while, I get a doctor's son who got busted for marijuana. I'd show up at the arraignment. And so I was doing a little bit of everything, and I kind of liked it. And I was kind of surprised that I was able to survive having no contacts other than, having a storefront in Brooklyn. And then...
So people would just come into your office or call you?
Well, I was pretty well connected with the older lawyers in the community. I got very active in the local bar association. Everybody would send me the kind of cases that they didn't want to do, but for me, they were meaningful cases. And those men did also serve as mentors because they gave me some guidance if I was doing something that was for a client of theirs and so on. So, long story short, one of my clients was, he had a small supermarket chain, and he invited me to an opening of his new supermarket. And we went there, and there were a lot of neighbors there. My parents were there. My parents' friends were there. And one of my parents' friends, one of my father's card-playing buddies, was a customs broker. And he said, you made a giant mistake. You made a big mistake. You shouldn't have left the customs field. These guys are making a fortune. And I said, well, that's very nice, but I kind of like what I'm doing, and I really don't want to go back to work for somebody.
Yeah.
So I said, well, who's looking for lawyers? And he mentioned a firm, and I said, well, I know the firm, and I said, they know me. Thought I was a big shot. So I was 26 years old. I said, I'm not putting together a resume. They know who I am. And if they want to speak to me, I'm happy to visit with them. So they called. I went down for an interview. It went well. I wasn't sure I wanted to go to work for anybody. I was still pretty happy working for myself. And then I went to the gentleman, the customs broker's office, to thank him for the reintroduction to this firm. And his partner said, wait a second, before you don't go there, there's a guy named Mendel and a guy named Grunfeld, and they just started a firm, and they're probably looking for talent. And that's how I got the interview. So I'm down here. I'll go over. And I went over there. They hired me, and they really couldn't afford to pay me.
But you had some money saved up, I'm sure, at this point.
Well, no, I had my other practice. So they said,
right.
we'll let you work per diem. We'll give you projects. Okay. You'll bill us by the hour, and we'll bill you out to our clients. And you can do your other work on the side. So, in the morning, I was picking juries in the New York State Supreme Court for a trial. And in the afternoon, I was preparing responses to customs inquiries. And that went on for about 6 months, and it just got to be too burdensome, and I had to make a choice to go one way or the other.
So you got away your own practice, you said no more, and you jumped on to be a founding partner, correct?
Exactly. So, and then that firm split up, and Harold Grunfeld and I and some other partners of that firm formed this current firm, Grunfeld, Desiderio, Lebowitz, Silverman, and Claystack.
And from that, it just moved to here. Let me ask you, because I know you have a family and a wife. When were you able to find a wife during this entire time?
Well, I married my high school sweetheart. Well, this is another cute story. I was going to this boys' Catholic high school, and in my senior year, I had detention every day, so I had to stay after school for an hour to make up for whatever wrongdoing I had done during the course of the day. And so I had an after-school job, and her house was halfway between that job and my school, so I passed her, and we met, and we've been together ever since.
High school.
She was 15, I was 16.
Wow. Ever since. And you have how many kids?
2 children.
2 children and grandkids.
And 4 grandchildren, yes.
Wow. Okay. So that's a lot. That came out of it from high school. I wouldn't have expected. That is a lot, but I'm guessing this is the only way, because you wouldn't have had time anyways throughout that.
That's correct. Well, let me tell you about the other mentor, and it's a very important mentor. My grandfather had a men's clothing shop.
Yeah.
And I worked there after school, and he wanted me to catch the dust before it fell. There was no time during that afternoon that I could stand still. So if there's a customer in the store, I sold them a tie. If there was no customer in the store, I mopped the vestibule. If the vestibule was clear, I swept the street. If the windows were dirty, I washed the windows. I even learned calligraphy to write the sale tickets for this display window. And he was paying me 69 cents an hour. Now, I'm old, but I'm not that old. So my friends were delivering for the pharmacy, the grocery store, and so on. They were making $2 an hour and another $1 or $2 in tips. And every day I would come into my grandfather and say, what is this, depression? 69 cents an hour? Are you kidding?
For family.
So he said, well, you should pay me for the education you're getting here. And of course, I brushed it off. It didn't resonate with me at the time, but in looking back, that work ethic served me very, very well.
Yeah, I bet. And you know what? I want to talk about a little bit about trade here as well, because I mean, your work ethic, there's no question, obviously, you're a founding partner of GDLSK, and that has been, by the way, you're sponsoring some of the stuff here at the conference, at the GTE conference in Oklahoma City. So that's huge that you're able to do that, correct? Yes. But trade in the you said you started 1970s, right? Around, and that was not trade. Was that already
It was
trade?
customs. It's customs and
correct.
trade. There was anti-dumping, of course, because that statute goes back to 1912. But our focus was trying cases in the customs court, which is now the Court of International Trade.
Yeah.
And it was mostly classification and value.
How does that transfer to now? Do you think that is still very much relevant as much as it was in the 1970s?
Yes.
Or do you think things have...
It's a core to the practice, and now with the changing tariffs, the rapidly changing tariffs, the valuation and classification of merchandise is very important, because if you're on the wrong spot, you're going to pay excessive duties.
Yeah.
And if you haven't structured your transaction properly, you'll also be paying excessive duties, which you can't get back.
Yeah. So things have changed, but, well, at this moment, they're more aggressive, I assume, a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. But, these trade wars are nothing new. There have been trade wars all through my career. They just didn't make the front pages of the paper. So, if there was a Nixon surcharge for 10% across the board on every product from every country, it was on page 8.
Yeah.
And then we had the beef hormone wars and the chicken wars and the banana wars. And those are all long stories. But basically, these are retaliatory actions taken against other nations, in the cases I've just mentioned, particularly the EU, and for their unfair trade practices.
Yeah. And that is the current status of us
Well,
right now,
it's been aggravated. My view of the world is, whether you like the current administration or not, these changes were long overdue. And it's particularly stressful for me and my clients and the brokers that are here today, because it's uncertainty is the death knell for any company.
I think uncertainty has become the new normal. That's what we say now. So people have to, unfortunately, adjust to uncertainty, which there's no way of adjusting to uncertainty because we just don't know.
Some of these changes were long overdue. The problem is trying to implement them in 3 to 6 months.
Yes, taxing. So let me ask you, we're now in the now. You're a huge trade lawyer. Everyone knows who you are. Is this something you see yourself doing because people love working? Well, if you love what you do, you're going to do it forever. Is that your plan?
I happen to love working.
Yeah.
I love working in the office. I like mentoring some of the young lawyers. I like, getting new clients, coming up with new strategies to serve their needs. I travel internationally quite a lot.
Yeah.
And now, except for this immediate time, I usually have some time off during some of these overseas business trips to take a couple of days in holiday.
What is your favorite thing to do when you're not busy?
I have a lot of different interests. I'm a movie buff. I love the theater. I love the ballet. I love horseback riding. I love shooting handguns. I used to love scuba diving until my doctor said I shouldn't be doing it anymore. So I have a lot of different interests. And I could keep myself busy if I retired tomorrow, but I can't think of anything that I would prefer doing with the bulk of my time than working.
And you've been doing it for so long, and it says a lot about you that you still want to continue doing it for however long you would like, right?
As long as I'm standing, I really have no interest in. I could possibly slow down, but I think when it comes to retirement, you're either in or out. You just can't do the retirement part-time. I guess depending on your field of interest, but I think you have to be in with your both boots in, and especially at this time when the rules of engagement change almost on a minute-by-minute basis.
Well, I have to say that you're a great mentor, because I know my friend Sarah, who works in the office, the GDLSK office, and who is a learning attorney. You mentor her, and always,
I love mentoring.
Yes, she is fantastic, and that's how we got in touch, because she said, I have to put the story in. She said, Annick, you need to meet Frank because he has the best stories. And he does have the best stories. So if you ever come across Frank at a conference, or you want to call him up for being a new client, which I don't think you take new clients, right?
I do.
You do?
Yeah, I'm still, it's interesting, especially during this current upheaval. I'm getting calls from the grandchildren of some of my early clients.
Yeah.
And they're saying, my grandfather, heard about this problem I'm having, and he said, "You're the only guy who can help me." So it's kind of flattering because I still have this vision of myself as a poor kid loading trucks for UPS.
Yeah.
And now to be getting calls in the middle of the night from Indonesia or Hong Kong or Europe, it's kind of flattering.
No, it is. I mean, your story is incredible, and to go from 69 cents of work to
An hour. It was an hour.
An hour. Oh, an hour to now, doing what you're doing and being able to provide the work you can to all these people and big companies. I don't know if you can talk about these companies.
I really can't, but big and small. But I do a lot of work in the luxury goods sector. So if you named an Italian or a French designer, either I or a member of my firm would probably represent them in the customs area.
Yeah, that's incredible. So I want to round this up, but I want to ask, what are 3 things people who are just starting out, doing whatever, maybe even in the trade world, but just to succeed, what are 3 things that they should focus on?
I think they should have a plan. I think so many young people today don't have a plan. They kind of get up in the morning and what's going to happen to me today? But you have to have a plan, and you have to be able to accept the fact that that plan may not go as you hoped. And you have to be able to take the right turn or the left turn and so on. And I think just keep your eye on the ball, keep your eye on the goal, and that goal can change during the course of your life many times. But the last thing I would say is don't ever let anybody tell you you can't do something. When I graduated cum laude from St. John's, I had an Italian surname, and there are a lot of law firms that wouldn't interview somebody with an Italian surname, believe it or not. And you know what? Those firms are no longer around.
Yeah. Well, Kris Jenner always says, if someone is telling you no, you're asking the wrong person. So that's one thing I learned, because when you said, don't, you can do everything you kind of put your head to. Mm-hmm. Like sometimes it's people that get you down because they say, no, oh no, you can't do that. Oh no, like you're not the right fit for that.
Mm-hmm. And I think, and I tell young people that I mentor, I said, you may not be able to get through the front door. You may have to find the side way, or maybe go around the back, or maybe, find another entry point to the location you're trying to reach. But I think that's it. Maybe stubbornness is a good quality.
Yeah, I think so. I'm very stubborn. But, well, Frank, I want to thank you so much for doing this with me. It's been a long time coming. So again, Frank Desiderio, if you want to reach out to Frank, maybe you won't be able to reach him because he's a busy man.
You'll be able to reach me.
But he's here for trade needs or trade law needs. And I want to thank you for your inspiring story. I've been meaning to hear it, and I've heard lots of it, and I'm ready to continue for more because I know your stories will never end.
They will never end.
Which are great. So thank you so much, and thank you for being here at the GTE conference with me.
Thank you so much for your kind words and this opportunity. It's been great fun, and I can't wait to show this to my granddaughter.
Yes, that'll be fantastic. I'm excited. Well, thank you so much. And again, thank you to our listeners. We're so grateful for all the listenership we have. And let us know what you think of this. And yeah, be ready for the next one. Thank you. Bye.